Right now, with all the harder news going on this morning we've been talking about, let's have a little fun with this one. Many folks throughout our region are likely excited about a big movie event that lands tomorrow.
I'm excited. And it's been well over a quarter of a century in the making. We're talking about the sequel to the 1986 classic Top Gun. And this morning we have a live interview with Ole Miss Associate Professor, my former philosophy professor, Dr. Timothy Yenter. And one of the many courses he teaches is the philosophy of film.
Good morning, Dr. Yenter. I want to take your class. Thank you so much for joining us. So right now, let's just start with first off about this movie. What makes the release of this Top Gun sequel 36 years later so meaningful to so many people?
You know, the first film was such a cultural event. It hit a particular moment in American history where the idea of rethinking what it meant to be a part of the military was undergoing a kind of revision. And it hit those classic American themes that you see in films, right? Going back to Westerns on through Batman films, this lone person who's going to be out on the edge of society, pushing boundaries, and what does it mean for them to be incorporated into a larger group? So it had those classic themes as well as taking some new things, right? The director Tony Scott was coming out of advertising. So you had these like fast cuts, all these close-ups, this really well-told story. And it's part of what makes that film still feel fresh today, I think. And one of the big questions going into the new film coming out this weekend is it going to have that same freshness? Do we still want stories like this about movie stars being movie stars and figuring out where do these maverick-type figures fit into our society?
Well, your description there gave me a brief hint of John Rambo, if you're familiar with that movie, Sylvester Stallone. But anyway, back on topic here.
Well, what are some changes in our society and culture that have happened in the last 36 years that could cause today's younger generation to maybe interpret the message of Top Gun differently than, you know, how we did and who watched the original when it came out in 1986?
So one of the things that's really clearly happened and that this film helped inspire actually was a change in how we watch screens. So the really rapid editing, for instance, with lots of close-ups, is something that this film really helped innovate. And what we see now, of course, is that style has permeated television and as well as things like TikTok, right? So this idea, you know, people younger than myself are far more savvy with how editing works, with how lighting and camera angles work than my generation was coming up. But the question is, you know, can a film like this draw those people when you have all these options, right? When you have TikTok and Instagram, when you have Snapchat, and when you have all of these options before you, will people still go to the movies? And this film got delayed first because they wanted to do some reshoots and then because of the pandemic. And they really want this to be one of those big summer films like I remember growing up where people will go out and say, I need to see this in the movie theater and I need to see it more than once. So one of the big questions is, can it draw that first weekend as well as having legs to extend it?
It's kind of interesting that you make that point about how the younger generation is so tech savvy and so good with video, because the way that I shoot video, I definitely learned at my classes at Ole Miss. We learned about jump cuts. We learned about taking shots close up and then doing shots that are much more wider whenever you're getting B-roll. But I watched...
actually have a name. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but those shots are actually, each of them have a name.
Yeah,
go ahead.
But you know, we learned those terms in class. Meanwhile, my sister, who is 19, and kids that are younger than her who are on TikTok, it's like that's second nature to them. They didn't have to take those classes, and they are so skillful with that video. But that's the video part. Now the music part, different story.
Music part is different. That brings us to our next question. Now the soundtrack, personally, one of my favorite things in movies is the music, the orchestra, it's great. But now the soundtrack of Top Gun is among the most successful movie soundtracks of all time. Why do so many people love it? And I mean, nowadays, do people even care about the movie soundtracks anymore, except for me?
Yeah, so I mean, I remember growing up, you know, like that's one of those cassettes you'd see in everybody's car, or then later you'd go and get on CD again, right? And that idea actually of the whole album is something that's really shifted, right? The movement in the music industry the last 30 years not only is from buying physical media to streaming, but it's also listening to albums versus listening to singles. And now, of course, in the last year or so, the big push has even gone not from a single, but even to a particular clip from a song.
Yes.
There's a lot of pressure on artists to get that Lizzo style little clip that's going to go viral on TikTok. So this idea of, for my generation, you can't say the words "take my breath away" without hearing the music in your head, right? And that notion of listening all the way through versus having that little clip that you can dance to is a real big shift.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to see how the movie is going to try and capitalize on that shift.
In a minute, I'm gonna need a, no, I'm just kidding. I'm not gonna even attempt to do that, but I do have one more question. How do you think that the audience's excitement related to, movie stars has changed since then? Because Top Gun really did push Tom Cruise to a new level of stardom in 1986. And I feel like this question might kind of relate to that snippet of a music song.
Yeah. The old style of making a movie star by getting them into these big roles has really shifted. It's less due to the production company and the agents, and it's really shifted to how would-be stars use their social media. So the question is, can these old school stars, the Tom Cruises, the Julia Roberts, can they still draw an audience?
Yeah.
And I think one of the big, when we go to watch a Tom Cruise movie, we're there to watch Tom Cruise do stuff, right? Ultimately, every Tom Cruise movie is about Tom Cruise, right? Edge of Tomorrow is literally how does average Joe Tom Cruise become, action star Tom Cruise. And you can't go to a Mission Impossible movie without seeing him be Buster Keaton and Jackie Chan and James Bond and Jason Bourne all before the opening credits. So this idea of, is this going to work, where movie theater attendance has dipped these last couple of years, right, accelerated by the pandemic, but it was already happening. Can these big summer films draw that back? And one of the big questions that those of us who watch the industry will be watching is not only that first weekend, can it get that initial draw in, but will people keep coming back? Is this the kind of thing that people are going to say, I need to see it 2-3 times in the theater?
Well, Dr. Yenter, thank you so much for joining us. It's good to see you again, not in the classroom, but in the real world.